sunlight exposure on cognitive function for both depressed and non-depressed participants. And so basically the study just talked about, like, it gave a little background on melatonin and serotonin and some other mechanisms in the body that are shown to be involved in certain light or sunlight therapy and its effects on mood. And so these same mechanisms were shown to also be involved in the circadian rhythms that are associated with cognitive functioning. And cognitive functioning is regulated by these suprachiasmatic nuclei. And that nuclei is susceptible to the effects of differing intensities of and patterns of environmental illumination, so sunlight, in a sense. And so basically I'm just gonna put that there. Yeah, so the research just wanted to evaluate whether the amount of sunlight exposure affects cognitive function at all, and if there's like a correlation to the effect of the season. And so basically it just hypothesized that lower levels of sunlight exposure at participants' houses would be associated with an increased rate of cognitive impairment. And so this study gathered its insolation data from residential regions of, like, I think, 46 states. And it was just a national cohort study of both Blacks and whites over the age of 45. And I think there were more whites than Blacks, I think by like 10%. And basically they gathered their, or they measured sunlight exposure based in, they got their data from NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, and they assessed cognitive impairment by a 6-item screener questionnaire, and it tested the short-term recall and temporal orientation. And so basically just kind of concluded whether they were cognitively impaired or intact. And they assessed depression by the Center of Epidemiological Studies depression scale. And they used logistical regressions to model the association between insolation and cognition. And so basically what they found was the participants in the lowest category of insolation compared to those in the highest insolation had 1.36 times the odds of cognitive impairment. And so among the depressed participants, there was like a dose relationship between sunlight exposure and cognitive function. So the lower levels of sunlight was associated with impaired cognitive status. And they also found that the seasons of winter and spring were also more likely associated with, or compared to fall, gave a more increased odds of cognitive impairment. And there were a few potential co-founders, like sex, geographical region, population, and so on, but they only included sex, race, and education, income, age, region, and depression, as well as alcohol as covariates. The rest were just statistically insignificant, so they didn't really include it in the study. So basically what they found was among the participants with depression, there was, they just predicted a higher probability of cognitive impairment when there wasn't enough exposure to sunlight. And participants without depression didn't really have that much of a significant effect on their cognitive function as far as insolation goes. And yeah, this was the first study to examine the effects of sunlight exposure on cognition, especially in like a large cohort study. And so I think this research was just important in a sense that it just highlighted a lot of environmental and lifestyle effects for those who are more prone to seasonal affective disorder. And it also mentioned something about how light is shown to affect brain blood flow. And I thought that was really interesting. And it also said something about how, like, if you don't have enough cerebral blood flow, it's more likely to cause a decrease in cognitive functioning. So you can kind of see how that relates to like how big of an impact light can have on your functioning. And overall, it's just the relationships with serotonin, melatonin, and all those mechanisms have with sunlight kind of just suggests that they do have such a big impact on your cognitive function. I think that's all. Thank you.
Sarah, do you know how like participants were chosen to be in the study? I think I may have missed that.
They were just, so they chose a lot of people from like, I guess, backgrounds of like strokes. So like just kind of like to see how, I guess, that might affect their, I guess, because like their health is more in jeopardy, I guess. But I don't think they had any specifics really. It's just like states that were more prone to strokes, or people were more prone to strokes in those states.
Do you know if they saw the effects of solar stimulators or like, you know, artificial sunlight, if that could improve cognitive impairment in people that didn't get into actual sunlight enough?
Um, I think I didn't really focus on like the measurements of the insolation, so I'm not sure if it was like, if it had anything to do with sunlight, but I know overall it was like solar radiation, so I'm not sure if it's the same, but yeah. And they measured cognitive function with, I think I did mention this. There was wait, was that were there any? No, I don't think there was difference in exposure. I think they just, I think it was in a span of like 2 weeks. And no, I don't think they mentioned anything on pigmentation. Yeah, I didn't really, yeah, I don't know.
I think for the cognitive impairment, you said that there was a questionnaire that
Yeah.
a 6-question questionnaire.
Yes, it was a 6-item, and it measured like the, I think it was like temporal, like, yeah, spatial awareness and all that, and some, yeah.
What kind of questions did they ask to measure cognitive ability? Like, was it yes or no, multiple choice? Did they have to fill something out? Like, how
I
do you?
think it was, yeah, I think it was, I don't think it was a yes or no. I think it just kind of like tests in a way to kind of measure how well you can do cognitively. But I don't think they mentioned any specifics, or if they did, I probably didn't mention it or thought it was important to mention.
So in the conclusions, like, can you explain the conclusions again? I think I just like was not completely understanding.
No, it's
like,
okay.
What happened?
Yeah, so basically, people who were depressed were more likely to benefit from sunlight exposure, cognitively, anyways. But non-depressed people there wasn't that much of a significant impact.
So was it like dealing with? I know some people have like seasonal disorders where they like get sadder when it's like cold or winter outside. So was it like dealing with that type of depression specifically, or just like in general?
I think it was definitely general depression, and it kind of just spoke about how it could also play a role with seasonal depression, in the sense that they tested for seasonal effects on cognitive functioning, and they also found significant data with that.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, sorry, I'm new to this group, I think.
It's okay.
My name is Osvaldo. So I have 2 questions. The first one is, did the paper cite, or did you notice any research that the paper cited that was like pretty much a cornerstone of the methodologies that they used for their study. And then the second question is, did they identify or specify the demographic or the locations of where they got the popular sample group from? So was it all just like in one state? Was it spread out across the nation, et cetera, to account for, you know, if you grew up in an area that traditionally has less sunlight to begin with?
Definitely. For your first question, yes, they did use a lot of methodologies, I guess, from previous studies. They did mention how previous research studied the effects of like certain mechanisms and how they affect depressed people as far as their mood goes. So they kind of just wanted to do the same with cognitive functioning. And any connections. And for the second one, yeah, they did, it was a large study from like multiple states. So they just gathered mainly Black and white people from states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Arkansas. Yeah. So all over the place, yeah. Thank you for your question.
Sarah, I don't know if you saw John's question in the chat, but he asked if the participants were self-reported to have depression or was it like medically determined?
I did read that they did send them out questionnaires, kind of like to just self-report, like self-reported health in a sense. But I think the depressed ones, I mean, I would assume have to be medically determined. I don't think it would make sense for them not to be medically determined, because then but that's a good question. I didn't really notice. I didn't really notice. I'd have to get back to you on that if that's okay.
But Sarah, I think the paper you chose was really interesting in that it identified so many confounders. Because I feel like usually like with the basic science that we've had so far, like I feel like a lot of the articles that people have presented on so far have been just like hardcore, like in the lab, like the researcher just controls everything. So it's really interesting to read about like data analysis and stuff like this and how like so many different things can impact just like one disorder or just like mental illness in general. Because I know some of the confounders that they identified was like gender, socioeconomic status, like all these other different things. And I was reading my psych textbook this week, which ironically also talked about psychological disorders. And it talked about how schizophrenia, it spirals forward in the sense that people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, all of those different confounders that the people in your article also identified, like socioeconomic status. And okay, Shabazz, this textbook is actually interesting. Like just reading about the disorders is fun. But anyways, like just socioeconomic status and stuff like that, how it actually has a negative relationship with the diagnosis. So like people who are diagnosed with depression or specifically like schizophrenia, usually like it'll put them in a state of poverty. And because they're in poverty, they don't have access to like medical facilities or just the proper resources, it'll sustain that diagnosis. And it's actually interesting because like people from a lower socioeconomic status actually have like the highest rates of depression and schizophrenia as well. Definitely. I think I'm pronouncing it wrong. Schizophrenia. Wait, I think I just said that completely wrong.
We understand what you're saying. So
yeah.
But no, definitely. I find that very interesting how like confounding variables, especially with socioeconomic status, and how it's like a vice versa kind of thing. It's like people in low socioeconomic statuses are more likely to, you know, have health problems, and then people who have health problems are more likely to come from socioeconomic backgrounds that are just poor. But yeah, definitely seeing that relationship play out is really important. I took a course a few semesters ago, Sociology of Medicine, and if you're interested in that at all, I would.
Actually, next semester.
Yeah, it's an incredible course. It's probably one of my favorite courses I've taken at State. And it really just opens your eyes to just how sociology plays out in like healthcare. And there's so many different factors and like disparities that exist. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this just builds on the theme that we've been talking about for the past few weeks, just how research translates in the real world. Like there's so many other things to consider, like the sociological factors and everything that goes into it. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Do you guys, I don't know if this is too personal, but have you guys ever experienced any discrimination in healthcare, like if you know anyone or if you personally have experienced discrimination in healthcare. I know a personal example. I live with my grandparents, and they don't speak English very well, and I have to take them to all their appointments. Usually my parents are working, so I'm the one who goes with them, or my brother goes with them to most of their appointments. And sometimes the doctors, like, they don't want to take the extra few minutes it needs to understand what they're trying to say. Like, they can speak English, they can communicate, but it just takes a bit longer, and they might not use all the proper terms. So sometimes I feel like doctors will like not take their pain as seriously, or not, because like they'll tell them to rate their pain from 1 through 10. Like, that's not a common thing for them, so they'll just be like, I don't know, 4, 5. So like that's something I've experienced personally, but do you guys have any experiences like that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Did someone else want to talk? Okay. I translate at the hospital, and I've noticed that too. If like one of the patients like says something that doesn't really make sense in English, like I guess the way they describe it, it's like, you know, in every language things can be described differently. So if they describe a pain or a certain feeling they have, and the doctor hasn't really heard it or doesn't understand what they're saying, they're just like, they kind of just look at you like that's weird, but don't really address it. I just think it's terrible, and healthcare providers should be more understanding and more empathetic and willing to try to understand at the very least.
I completely agree with you. Wait, you said that you work in a hospital and you've experienced it as a like healthcare professional?
Well, I translate, so I volunteer, but like they'll pull me in to translate if they can't get someone over the phone or something. And I've noticed that happen a lot. So yeah, it's happened multiple times.
I definitely agree with John's point in the chat that sometimes it's like an implicit thing instead of something that's like overt. And I think that's why, like, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but the Harvard implicit bias test, but you can Google it and it'll usually be like the first or second link that pops up. And it's just a test designed to test you on your own implicit biases. So if you guys are interested in that, I'll definitely try to post a link to that on the blog. I think it's just a really interesting way for all of us to become aware of all of the different biases that exist in so many different fields, like gender or career or race and things like that, because like I feel like the first step to like really addressing these issues is to even become aware that you have a bias in the first place, which is really interesting. But also, like, another thing off Zainab's point, I think that in healthcare in general, there's such a huge concept of like paternalism, so like the mentality that the doctor knows best. And I feel like that really affects like the quality of care that you receive, because I definitely agree with Rebia's point, like being being a family of immigrants myself, like I've definitely felt like the struggle of like trying to translate for a parent who can't speak English that well, and how that affects the care that like my family personally has received. But another thing that I noticed that like throughout college, I've shadowed different doctors, and one doctor I shadowed was an orthopedic surgeon, and one doctor was Pakistani, and I usually shadow with him, but one day he was in surgery, so a different doctor like took me under his wing and I shadowed under him, and he was a white doctor. And just like seeing like the differences between the two, like in the way that they relate to immigrants who are not just like the same races as themselves, like Dr. Durrani, the doctor I shadowed, he was Pakistani, he just overall, even with like other immigrants who aren't just South Asian, like he took the time to like talk slowly, really break the concept of whatever the disease was down. Whereas when it was the white doctor, and personally that's what I've experienced as well, it was just a really quick diagnosis, kind of just like straight to the point. Okay, this is what you have. We'll write you a prescription, and then you're out the office in like 15 minutes. So I don't know, that's just one thing I've seen. And then also another thing going off paternalism is that a lot of doctors that I've shadowed, it's like, so like one time this patient, she had a whole list of questions about her disorder, because of course if you're sick you're going to have a bunch of questions. You're going to go on Mayo Clinic, you're going to go on PubMed, you're going to go on all these different websites that tell you whatever symptoms you're having. And the doctor was just really short with her. He was like every question she asked, he was so quick to like cut her off and saying, oh, don't worry about it, oh, this and that. And then in private, when we left the patient, after giving her a diagnosis, after we left the patient, he turned to me and he was like, wow, she had so many questions. This is why I hate the internet. I'm like, but you can't assume that the doctor knows everything, right? Because there's so many moments where like a doctor gets the diagnosis wrong. You have to go to a second doctor for another opinion and stuff like that. So just, I don't know, just saying that like personally is like really weird, especially because I want to go into the medical field myself. So I don't know. That's just my 2 cents on it. Sorry, that's a really long rant.
Myra,
My sister works. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was gonna say my sister works in a hospital. I myself have never experienced, or at least felt like I experienced discrimination. However, I have defense mechanisms that have been like called out to me more and more often now that I'm older and more mature, and things that I've noticed that I do to sort of protect myself. And I often come away wondering, wait a minute, is that the normal interaction that I might have in a hospital or with police authority or anywhere else where I'm like giving my trust onto somebody else for a service? Is that normal behavior that would occur if I wasn't Hispanic, if I wasn't brown? Same thing when my mom's English is so much better now than it was, a long time ago, but we used to go together and I would be her translator if they didn't have translators. And there would be an element of skepticism coming from my mother that I would have to translate. And I think some of that behavior, I've picked up. So I don't know if I've not experienced it because I've learned to stop it before it happens and I become aggressive about it, or if it's because, oh yeah, that's just like how all interactions go. So I think that's something worth examining. But then the other thing is my sister works in a hospital, and one of the things is that staffing, I think, is a problem, especially out in rural hospitals. If you don't have a diverse staff, then no matter how hard you work at receiving the trainings, you're never going to optimize your interactions with a diverse clientele or a diverse group of patients. And I think that's one of the big issues that hospitals need to get over. And there are unfortunately old brass or people in power within some of these hospitals who don't recognize diversity in their staffing as a problem, and therein won't target that as or make initiatives to try to fix that. And that adds on, I believe, to some of the issues that we see in misdiagnosis and disparities in healthcare.
Yeah, just to add on to that, to look back at what Shabazz said in the chat, I had something like that happen to me, and that was really frustrating. So I can't imagine like when it's your parent, like you're worried about them and stuff like that. But I go to a doctor in Clayton, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere, and I went to go get like my blood drawn just for a regular checkup. And then the tech was just so like, she was like, I was telling her, I'm like fasting, like how much blood are you going to take? Do I have to break my fast? And she was like, it's not a lot of blood, but yeah, you have to eat after this. I was like, but I'm fasting. Like if I don't have to, I'd rather not. She's like, but you're going to eat like a cookie or something, right? You're going to drink orange juice. And I'm like, no, I can't, like I'm fasting. And she just didn't get the concept of like, it's a full on fast, and I had to explain it to her. And she's like, oh, do you do that every single day? It's just so weird, like in healthcare that, and like he said, there's 2 billion Muslims in the world. And it's like that it's such a foreign concept is so like strange to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have experienced that even in like growing up. I don't know if you guys have learned about Islam, or other religions. I feel like everyone knows about Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, whatever it may be. Like I know Christianity. Like I can name you the main things, Like why can't other people in America name you things about Islam or like Hinduism, other culture? Like there's so many religions in America and they affect people's everyday lives, but why do we focus so much on Christianity? Like it just doesn't make sense. And I think that's so prevalent in our education system as well as the healthcare system, because like how can you be a healthcare provider and not know about Ramadan? Like it's a whole month of fasting. It's one of the most basic things in Islam. Like how can you be treating a patient and not realize that they haven't had food or water all day long and that they're going to be doing this for the next like 2 weeks? Like that's literally unacceptable. I don't know how that's still a thing in 2020.
Yeah, I've had a lot of, not anymore in college because a lot of people are more open-minded, but like in high school, like my entire public school career, I'm Jain, which is a pretty small religion. Not many people have heard of it, which I get. It's small, it's okay. But I've had a lot of issues with people saying, being really like ignorant of it. Like I'm vegetarian because of my religion since I was born. And I've had people say, oh, that's weird. You can just start eating meat when you're 18. I'm like, I will get very sick if I eat meat. I'm not going to just suddenly start eating it. And why are you offended by that? Like, I'm not hurting you in any way, shape, or form. Let me do my life.
Yeah, I totally agree.
That was
Well,
actually
I'm actually from a really small town in North Carolina from
You really-
Albemarle. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, but it is so tiny. And my high school was in an even smaller town called Meisenheimer, like literally so tiny. And I remember, I think during my freshman year of high school, or maybe like when I was in middle school. So when our world history curriculum, when it started shifting towards more like teaching about Islam or Hinduism and other religions, there were actually protests at the school and like PTA meetings to stop like teaching about Islam and stuff like that. Like people were actually offended that students were being taught about Islam in like world history. So I don't know. I was like, what? I don't know, but just growing up with that experience, like I know a lot of us like with our discourse about things and stuff like that, like usually it's like the mentality, oh my God, it's 2020, like come on. But I feel like it just like highlights like, even though like time has moved on, like it feels like things are equal, there's so much like, I guess, implicit bias in all of us, and just things like that. It's just, I don't know, it's just shocking, I guess.
Maria, it's funny to me that you say that because I grew up in Wendell, North Carolina, and when I went to the elementary school there, I was one of, I think, 6 Spanish or Hispanic Latinx students there, and there were no others, and they had no idea how to train us. Or educate us. They had no idea how to like work with 2 languages, any of this other stuff, or even like bridge cultural gaps. I was very lucky, or the school was very lucky to have a principal. Her name was Miss Roundtree, and she was very progressive in her ideals on how to, meet some of these challenges. So they actually hired a specialist from out of the state because they couldn't find anybody who knew what to do. They hired a specialist to come in and start like unique programs or programs specific for integrating new demographics into the school and making sure that they started working on an ESL program and all sorts of other stuff, because at that time, the majority of Hispanic students would not go to school, which is why you only had 5, because they were working on farms with their families, because a lot of the families were migrant farm workers. So I feel you on that whole small town thing. And there was pushback when Ms. Roundtree tried that, but it worked. And,
That's
Yeah,
really
no.
amazing that they started that program though, because I remember in Wilson we had a similar issue with like a lot of kids dropping out to like go work, but there was no support, and like oftentimes the ESL services would just be used like really, like I was put in ESL even though like I grew up in Toronto and they were like ESL, and I was like that doesn't make sense. I also feel like there's a lot of like Mario was saying earlier, like we talk about how like we're all like it's 2020, we should move on, but a lot of times like in like smaller towns and also smaller like areas and schools, it's definitely a white majority, or like they're underrepresented. And it's like you definitely don't have the institutional power, because I remember in my in my that's so funny. I was also in ESL until 2nd grade, but that's just because I didn't talk at school because I was also shy. But yeah, that's because like in schools they don't even like the people are there, but they don't have any representation. Like I remember like our school district was 50% black, but only 3 of the schools, like the middle schools, were like not majority white, and it was just really weird because like there's a lot of gerrymandering going on, and also like that translates to like how we have medical practitioners. It's like the more white schools get more funding, so then they also get into better schools, and then they go on and they can keep going. And that's why I feel like a lot of times like when you're in healthcare you have, or like you're going to a doctor, I have to talk like really white or else it just doesn't work, or they just don't take you seriously. And yeah, like it's very hard to like not, like you were saying earlier, Oswaldo, like it's hard to like not be defensive, because I feel like when I'm dressed in like less white, like when I'm less white passing, well not passing but like adjacent, like I'm treated less kindly, like in the summer when I'm tan, or I'm like with my family, or like not wearing white clothes and speaking in very like proper, I'm not calling everybody ma'am and sir in a very like
enunciating way, I'm treated a lot worse, and I have to like be this like 200 times like concentrated person to just get that minimum level of care.
I totally agree with all the points that have been made. Also, Hassan made a really good point in the group chat, but I think it's time to move on to Naylea. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm so sorry.
Naylea, it's okay.
Naylea, I'm so sorry. But let's move on to your presentation, and hopefully we can continue this discussion in the blog or in future meetings.
All right, so I did my I researched an article about an ingredient. Oh yeah, that's fine. An ingredient from milk that was very important in colonization of bacteria in the human gastrointestinal tract. So basically, immunoglobulin G, or IgG, is an ingredient in milk which is proven to increase the adherence of this bacteria to HT29 cells. And HT29 cells are just cells in the intestine, and specifically the concentration of this ingredient affects the bioactivity, and the glycans of the IgG are involved in, modulating the intestinal cells and making sure everything is going correctly. It provides a strong case for including IgG ingredients for cow's milk and other food groups to promote good gut bacteria. This specific bacteria colonize the human GI tract, and it's believed that they can provide many health benefits. They protect against pathogens through competitive exclusion. They provide nutrients by digesting carbs that we can't. And there are currently no products that help increase this bacteria in the intestine, despite a growing demand for probiotics. So a couple of things for background. In the early stages of life, the biggest influence on the microbial colonization is ingesting milk or colostrum. Colostrum being that first milk, secretion, for breastfeeding, the first milk. It contains many nutrients, immunoglobulins, growth factors, vitamins, etc., which are very good for our health. And previous studies have shown that specifically bovine colostrum can restore the damaged mucosa, which is good for people who have diseases that need more bacteria to help them be healthier. The current study is so for this study they were trying to figure out the main component in milk that helps do all of this. So basically they started with bovine colostrum milk and mature milk, and they collected it, they defatted it, they performed centrifugation, and they figured out the main components, and then they separated them. Once they figured out the four main components, they so the four main components were oligosaccharides and lactose, alpha lactobumin, beta lactobumin, and the IgG, and that was the first step. And then afterwards they isolated just the IgG because they saw that was the main influence on increasing adhesions of the bacteria, and so they isolated IgG. They took the samples with the most of content of IgG and performed more experiments to see which concentration would be the best for increasing the number of bacteria attached to the cells. They used 3 different types of bacteria, and then they used the HT29 cells to develop a monolayer for which they would put the treatments on. And the results were that the 4 main components were these, as you can see on the table, and the biggest fold change, which is basically just the one with the most bacteria attached to it, was IgG, as you can see, and that was very important in determining, what was the cause of this, cause of the bacteria attaching more. Then they performed the same thing with the 2 other bacteria to see if their theory would hold up, and it did. There was a slightly bigger increase on one of them and then slightly smaller, but pretty much the same results. And then they were like, well, let's see what the best concentration of this IgG would be. And as you can see on the table, they started with 2 and they ended with 24. And the best concentration, so it went up all the way to 16 milligrams per milliliters, and then it went down. So obviously 16 was the best one. And then they performed this other experiment, which I was a little bit confused about, but basically they came to the conclusion that like after periodite oxidation of the glycoproteins, the structure kind of changes of the IgG, and it makes it worse for the bacteria to adhere to the cells. And so basically they figured out that the glycan part of the IgG was the most important, as you can see from the difference between the treatment and just the IgG left alone. They then performed the same experiment. So the previous results were just from colostrum. They then performed the same thing with the mature milk, and they found pretty much the same results again. The IgG impacts the adhesions. But the important thing to note is that in comparing the colostrum on the right and the mature milk on the left, the colostrum showed the biggest difference than the mature milk, which kind of proves a previous study that they had analyzed that showed that the first secretion or the first milk makes the biggest impact. So, and then this is just like a visual of the results. And so basically image A is the untreated monolayer of the intestinal cells, and then B, C, D are just treated groups, either like the B over here treated with the bacteria added, IgG treated with no bacteria, and then no IgG with bacterium. And as you can see, this one has a lot more cracks than the other 3, which kind of proves that the IgG and the bifidobacteria work hand in hand and damage and assist in healing the damaged mucosa. And it's beneficial for our health, obviously, because this is like really, really cracked and that's bad. So their findings were that the immunoglobulin G is the main component in promoting gut health, and they make the good bacteria adhere to the intestinal tract better, and then their optimum concentration that they found, and then smoother cells. Cells were smoother with the immunoglobulin G and the bacteria. And this study is very important because it helps restore intestinal health in people with not enough commensal bacteria, and it can help people with disorders like inflammatory bowel disease, obesity, and other syndromes. So yeah.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this in the beginning, but do you know why they made this study, or like why they chose to do this study?
So they had, researched a lot about like how milk is beneficial for us, like bones and everything. And specifically, they knew that we have good bacteria in our intestinal tract, and so they wanted to do more research on like what attracts bacteria to our intestinal tract more, so people who don't have enough of that good bacteria can have more and acquire it from ingredients from milk that can be put into other foods, so that it can be accessible for everyone.
Okay. That's really, really interesting, because personally I don't really like milk that much.
Wait, Rabia, me neither.
So if I could avoid it, I think I would.
And Rabia, I think another implication, like at the end of the paper, they talk about how they can use this as like a way to make better probiotics for people. Because like if you take antibiotics, a lot of the time it might kill all like good gut bacteria too. So usually doctors will give you probiotics to kind of re-stimulate that growth. So at the end of the paper, I think they said that this is a really good alternative to have a probiotic that's effective in re-stimulating that growth.
Oh, okay. So it's like kind of a substitute if you don't drink milk. You can get this, like, increase this bacteria in your immune system through like a probiotic or something.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
How did they obtain colostrum for this study?
Can you repeat that?
How did they obtain the colostrum for this study?
So I didn't really put that in there, but in the journal it said that they obtained it from like a research center.
Hassan, I think that colostrum and like stuff from the bovine stuff, I think that's commercially available for a lot of labs. Because personally, in my lab, we use a lot of bovine-derived things. So I think that's just like a good thing to do research on or something. Because like it's really good at stimulating growth in general. I'm not sure exactly how they isolate it. That's what all the Thermo Fisher, all those big companies that get millions of dollars, that's their job to figure out. We just use it.
Yeah.
As I understand it, colostrum's like the first milk, right? Like if a cow had just had a calf, that would be like the. Oh, I was just wondering because I know it's super valuable for farmers. Apparently, like they spend hundreds of thousands on this stuff to make sure that none of their calves die because there's like huge immune effects in cows as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's just like a research center that like worked with the cows and stuff, so that's how they got it.
I know for our lab, when we work with like bovine chromaffin cells, you can just get them from a slaughterhouse or something not far. It's pretty easy.
I think John asked a question in the chat. Do you know if they checked the IG levels or saw if good gut bacteria were present in people that were lactose intolerant or something not traditionally in their diet?
So they didn't actually test this on people. They use gastrointestinal cells because obviously, they would have had to go through another process to test on people. I don't know if we're like focusing on like lactose intolerant people, but I definitely think that this would be beneficial for them, considering that like when they were getting the IgG isolated or the milk rather isolated, they took away like all of the lactose and like all of the other stuff, like the fat and everything that they didn't need. So this could definitely potentially probably be beneficial for the people who are lactose intolerant.
And I think, John, the problem with lactose intolerance is like, I think it happens in like when you're actually like, when the food is actually being digested. So like, I think the small intestine doesn't have lactase to break it down. So like when all that stuff goes down into the GI tract, that's when the bacteria start breaking it down. And the bacteria there, I think the good and the bad, they produce like methane gas. And that's what like pulls water like with your stool into like the rectum, and that's what causes all the diarrhea. So I don't know if this would help with that. I think it would be more targeted towards making sure you actually have like lactase in your small intestine or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's how a lactate pill works. Like some people have to take those pills, maybe contain some sort of lactase. I don't really know. But yeah, there's a lot of gas involved when it comes to bacteria breaking down stuff, especially like if you're lactose intolerant and drink milk or something.
I remember reading a study about this. It was talking about how like you should continue like if you can't take lactase enzyme directly, and if you're lactose intolerant, you should try to have some sort of dairy product that's like very low in lactase, just so like your gut bacteria can continue to like produce lactase in the future, and like hard cheeses or like butter or something. I wonder like and I also saw like you can do this with other like allergies, I guess, like people who have peanut allergies and stuff, like the histamine reaction is reduced if you do it in like micro dosing. So I wonder like if this can be used in a similar manner.
There was an interesting study that I was reading where it showed that if you lived in a house that exposed you to certain microbes. Like if a pregnant woman had a dog in the house that shed a lot, children like her children would be less likely to be allergic to dogs because one of the initial microbe interactions they would have would be microbes present normally on dogs that you wouldn't find in a household if the dog wasn't there. So there are a lot of like interesting things where in the initial like stages of development for the gut microbiome, a lot of like microbial exposure can play into how your allergies develop and how your immune system responds with the gut, or how the gut microbiome responds to help your immune system to adapt to certain things.
Also, did they test for adhesion of anything else? Because I remember reading in the journal, and I may have missed it, that they tested for a whole bunch of like growth factors and other things. But so like, did they do any like follow-up experiments on the other stuff?
I didn't read anything about the other stuff. I think they just like saw the four main things, like the oligosaccharides and the lactose and the alpha and beta lactobumin, and then they just didn't really focus on that much.
Was there any mention of the mechanism by which the antibody sort of promoted, I guess, better cell growth? Like, is it because it triggers like maybe an immune response to clear out anything that it wouldn't want, that it allows for normal bacteria to grow, or is there like an adhesion factor that the Immunoglobulin G sort of provides for good bacteria that would normally be present there, or did they not go into that detail?
I think it was the first thing that you mentioned, how like they like make it the environment like safe for the bacteria to come in. They didn't really describe too much in the background of the study, but I think it's the first thing you said. So for John's comment, that was, but some people don't have milk the rest of their lives, but still have healthy gut microbiomes. So I think they were just focusing on how like the first milk impacts the rest of your life, like your gut, not like after a while, like drinking milk your whole life and all of that. I think it was just like the big how like the first milk impacts you, like how your microbiome is kind of formed rather than like changed, I guess, and then how people who don't have as much good bacteria can be helped rather than like the other people. I don't think they researched on like the difference between like the people with the good and the bad. I didn't see any like mention of that.
Also, do you know why they specifically chose bifidobacteria? Is it that just like the most dominant strain in the gut?
Perhaps, yeah. I don't know if the IgG product is added to milk formulas.
So for the whole milk, not having milk for the rest of their lives, there's being lactose intolerant is actually normal in the general human population. About like 30% of people can actually digest milk. So it's even, I don't know if milk actually affects what type of bacterium or bacteria you have in your gut, because if the general population can't drink milk, but the general population still have pretty healthy gut microbiomes, I don't know if there's actually a relationship.
When you're born, most humans can digest milk. But you can't digest it into your like early adolescence. But as a baby, most humans are capable of digesting milk. Most mammals actually are. And some adult humans obviously have evolved to be able to digest milk their entire life. But every human does start out being able to.
Yeah, going off what Hudson said, I think in or in Europe, I think it was natural selection that made it easier for like, because like most of their diets at that time was around dairy anyway, so it became like an evolutionary advantage if you could break down dairy products if you were older. So that's why that gene got selected for. And also one quick thing I want to mention, when I was reading this journal, I really like that they had a key points section. So like it goes abstract, and right under it, it goes into the introduction and the key points. Because that's something that I haven't really seen in a lot of papers, like having a key points section like that. I think that's a really like neat way to make it really easy to find like the key points of an article and see if it's like relevant to you or not, instead of having to like read through the whole article to figure that out. So just want to mention I like that.
Yeah, that was one of the main reasons why I chose it, because some of them can be a little hard to read.
And just the overall language of the paper was super easy to read and understand. So